Greetings. I don't blame Donald Trump for not necessarily taking all the best actions at the start of the pandemic. At the time, our knowledge was limited, and our resources were limited, and we weren't sure what was to come. For instance, we wanted medical personnel to have masks, and the number of masks available was limited. And we didn't yet know that it was possible to be completely asymptomatic and yet to infect other people. So, at first, even Dr. Fauci didn't recommend that we all wear masks. We were scrambling to figure out exactly what was going on and how best to deal with it. But once it became apparent that we were going to have a pandemic on our hands, and once we learned that indeed one could be asymptomatic and yet pass on the disease to another person, and once we had a sufficient supply of masks, it became clear that we should all wear masks. Medical experts converged on a set of steps we should take: wearing masks, practicing social distancing, doing widespread testing, and contact tracing. A temporary economic lockdown, taking the 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 weeks described by President Trump's CDC head, Dr. Redfield, to tamp down the coronavirus rate while prioritizing those medical steps for everyone, thereby minimizing the duration of the needed lockdown and giving financial relief to the people who are staying home so that they could pay for groceries and pay the rent while they weren't out making money. We knew what we had to do. And President Trump knew very early that the disease was real and more deadly than the ordinary flu, as we know from the recording of his telephone conversation with Washington Post reporter Bob Woodward. By listening to the medical experts, he could have had the country take steps that would have minimized the damage done by the coronavirus to human health, and also minimized the damage done by the coronavirus to the economy. He could have. He should have. But he didn't. We're now in the midst of a third wave, a third spike of coronavirus cases, and the number of coronavirus deaths just keeps increasing. Trump's policy choices and his attitude have combined to make the pandemic much worse than it had to be, and have cost tens of thousands of human beings their lives. I ran the figures about a week ago. The United States has about 4.2% of the world's population, but about a week ago, had about 19.65% of the coronavirus deaths. To someone who values fetal life, that ought to be especially galling, since presumably the lives of adult humans and of some children count at least as much as the lives of fetuses. So pro-lifers must be upset about Trump, right? Not only didn't Trump take all the steps necessary to deal with the coronavirus, he undermined efforts to minimize the damage by making mask wearing seem like a political statement instead of a patriotic duty to save the lives of one's fellow Americans. And by holding events like the fake Republican National Convention, rather clearly illegally held at the White House, and like rallies held around the country at which most people haven't worn masks. Has Trump told his followers to wear their masks? No. When they don't wear their masks, Trump treats it as just a personal choice, having nothing to do with public health or with personal responsibility, which one would think might appeal to the Republican nature. And now we have research showing that indeed Trump's rallies are killing people. Here's the URL for a paper showing that. So here is the URL for a paper describing how, yes, Trump rallies are causing deaths. Now it's been up a few seconds, and I will go back to my video. I've been trying to decide whether or not Trump counts as a mass murderer. Surely he does in a moral sense. He was responsible for directing American policy during the outbreak, and where his leadership could have made the difference between respect for the best medical advice on one hand and contempt for it on the other, he chose to communicate to his followers that contempt for it was the right attitude. His actions and his inactions have caused tens of thousands of needless deaths, according to the CDC. Moreover, they predictably, foreseeably led to tens of thousands of needless deaths. He knew about the severity of COVID-19, but deliberately failed to do what was necessary to save lives. He had the information available to him about what was needed in order to save lives, and he deliberately ignored it because he didn't like it. If mass deliberately letting die doesn't count as mass murder, well, it sure counts as something. Mass manslaughter, mass reckless endangerment. Morally, it's certainly criminal. Legally, though, it's not so clear. I've looked up various federal statutes. The federal homicide statutes seem to be found at 18 U.S. Code Scholium 1111 through 1122. The first one, 1111, is the murder statute. Murder is defined therein as the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. I don't see how to demonstrate malice on Trump's part, so although it's quite possible that he did act with malice, I'm not sure his behavior legally counts as murder in the sense of it's being something that he could reasonably be charged with. I actually spent quite a bit of time looking up reckless endangerment, criminal negligence, negligent homicide, and depraved indifference. Findlaw.com distinguishes between recklessness and negligence, with recklessnesses meaning that the person knew or should have known that his action was likely to cause harm, but negligences meaning that the person acted in violation of a duty to someone else, with the breach of that duty causing harm to someone else, both of which seem to me to be applicable to Trump. I'll show you a URL for that. And there is the URL. To my surprise, I couldn't find a federal reckless endangerment statute or criminal negligence statute or the like. At least some states have them, but there's no federal statute for it that I can find. Actually, I will amend that in a moment. LegalMatch.com has this to say about criminal negligence. Criminal negligence requires more than just a mere mistake in judgment, inattention, or ordinary carelessness. It generally refers to conduct that is so outrageous and reckless that it is a clear departure from the way an ordinary, careful individual would have acted. Although I'm sure Trump's defenders would say that his poor handling of the COVID-19 pandemic was a simple mistake in judgment, or else deny that it was poor handling at all, it seems clear to me that it counts as something more, as described. Ask yourself how you would have acted. Was his behavior a clear departure from that? I'll give you that Legal Match URL. And there is the URL for Legal Match. But, and here's the emendation I promised, I have come to think that, in fact, at the federal level, such crimes are subsumed under the manslaughter statute. You'll see what I mean in a moment. 18 U.S. Code Scholium 1112 is the manslaughter statute, where manslaughter is defined as the unlawful killing of a human being without malice. So Trump needn't have acted with malice toward anyone in order possibly to have committed manslaughter, according to the federal statute. It's then divided into two different kinds: voluntary manslaughter and involuntary manslaughter. Voluntary manslaughter is characterized as being upon a sudden quarrel or heat of passion. Pretty clearly, I think, inapplicable to Trump, or at least not demonstrably applicable to him. Involuntary manslaughter is characterized as being in the commission of an unlawful act not amounting to a felony, or in the commission in an unlawful manner, or without due caution and circumspection of a lawful act which might produce death. Now, I should think that the discharge of his presidential duties would count as the commission of a lawful act, and that the discharge of his presidential duties with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic would count as the commission of a lawful act which might produce death. After all, bad policy or insufficient attention to the recommendations of medical or public health experts can result in death. Well, deaths, plural. from COVID-19. And I should certainly think that his ignoring the best medical and public health advice, and his failure even to encourage his followers to wear their masks, his failure to try to instill in them its being their patriotic duty, counts as acting without due caution and circumspection, which you'll have to forgive me for saying, seems like his normal modus operandi. When does he act with due caution and circumspection? Therefore, I think Trump pretty clearly counts as guilty of involuntary manslaughter, according to the federal criminal code. He may be guilty of other offenses at the state level, but at the federal level, I think it's involuntary manslaughter. So I think he's morally guilty of murder. Surely he had all the information he needed to understand that his actions, or in some cases inactions, would predictably and foreseeably lead to a great many needless deaths. And yet he deliberately and intentionally took those actions, or in some cases, failed to take the appropriate actions. And that sure seems like bringing about human deaths with malice aforethought, but it might not have been actual malice. It's hard to read another person's motivations, and Trump's motivations are particularly unclear, as I've noted elsewhere that it's often difficult to tell which of his many character flaws is on display at any given time. But legally, surely he's guilty of involuntary manslaughter under the federal code. Presidents get lots of leeway in policymaking, and they should. There's always going to be disagreement, and often strenuous disagreement, over what the right policy or the wrong policy really is. And we don't want political disagreement to get turned into criminal prosecution. But here, it's a matter of deliberately ignoring facts that he himself knew, and of intentionally ignoring the best medical and public health advice, and of willfully allowing his followers to violate the best medical practices, even of encouraging them to do so. And surely that counts as involuntary manslaughter. That's not just political disagreement. As always, may reason and compassion be your guides.